So we are moving now to studying a system. We are going to start with the skin system or the integumentary system. So the skin has several functions, so you can almost draw a parallel between the skin, a cell membrane, or an epithelium in general. So there's the aspects of protection, of keeping hydration, not losing anything, allowing a certain defense against abrasion, and so on and so forth. But in the system, we need to include also accessory components, such as the hair, the glands, and, for example, the nails as well. So we spoke before about what a cutaneous membrane is. So an epithelium with a piece of connective tissue. And see, if we cover that, it's relatively easy for us to know what a cutaneous membrane represents. So there is this, you can find books that can put the dermis as a different part of the skin, but normally we consider the cutaneous membrane being the epidermis, which is the epithelium, essentially the epithelium, and the dermis, which you can see essentially as the connective tissue. And then you have accessory structures, which which include the hair follicles, the glands, which are all exocrine, and the nails as well. So let's start with this anatomy, but keeping in mind that we have different areas of the skin. So our skin is thicker, for example, the palm of our hands, thinner elsewhere. So there variants. There's a certain variation depending on the areas of the body. So I will then again here. This book, for example, talks about the skin and the hypodermis. It's a way of seeing it. It's some anatomies don't like to include the hypodermis in the skin. So let me just go back to the picture. So the dermis is normally included in the skin. The hypodermis would be the tissue underneath that. So you could find, for example, like in this picture, you're seeing the yellow represents fat tissue. But so that cutaneous membrane has several functions that are more or less intuitive, but just to give you a sense of those functions, to make sure we all get the same idea. So protection is a key component, not only protection from abrasion, but protection from the sun, protection from chemicals. So it lines the outside of the body. And by lining the outside of the body is also allowing a certain regulation of temperature. So we are not exposed directly to what's happening on the outside, but we also have glands that can help us regulate the heat loss. We sweat more, for example, or sweat less. By being in interaction with the outside, we can take things from the outside in through the skin, not many, but we can also send things out from the skin. We can excrete things from the skin. We can produce vitamin D through the sun. We don't speak much about that in anatomy, but you will learn that the way humans produce vitamin D is by the sun exposure. Then this vitamin D still needs to be activated by two organs, but it is still an important step to form the vitamin D. And then is a way of interacting with the world, and there's a lot of sensory reception through nerve endings. So the skin has two layers, epidermis and dermis. It may have a more subcutaneous or hypodermis layer that you may or not include under the designation of dermis, some people of skin. Some people do it, some people don't. So this is, but again, it represents layers. So you have the epidermis, underneath the dermis, and then the hypodermis, and then you would have then the muscle. So this matters just to understand, for example, burns. I'll show you some slides by the end of this lecture with the burns and skin burns, and you see what how this is important. So what I will talk to you about is essentially what are the goals of this lecture. Essentially to know the layers of the epidermis and know a little bit about the accessory organs. There are a few cells that have special names in the epidermis. So you can talk about the epithelial cells that produce keratin as the keratinocytes. Though they produce keratin, remember, the skin is a stratified epithelium that is squamous, but in most, in the body, it has some layer of keratin that is produced by the keratinocytes. Deeper, we have also melanocytes, which are cells that produce melanin, the skin pigment. We also have receptors, tactile epithelial cells, and then we have something called dendritic cells / macrophages. So this book still calls it dendritic cells, but I will tell you just a little bit about this in just a second. Okay, so if you never heard of dendritic cells or macrophage, don't worry too much about it, because I will explain to you in just a second. So the keratinocytes exist in the deepest layers of the epidermis, and it has keratin. The keratin has a function that is supposed to be somewhat protective, and as we study it more, we can realize that it kills some bacteria and it has some enzymes. So let's talk about the layers of the epidermis. So you have to memorize these layers. It's part of this part of the exercise of knowing the skin is to know the order of these layers. But again, some areas of the body have more or less of these layers. So the first, starting with the most superficial, is the corneum, then the lucidum, the granulosum, the spinosum, and the basale. So, or if you want to see it the other way around, you start with the basale. So the basale is close to the basal lamina. These are cells that are growing. These are cells that have division, capacity of division. So the stem cells are here. And then, starting from here, the cells are older and older. So by the time you reach the corneum, you have essentially dead cells. And so what you scrape off when you wash yourself is basically the corneum. So what are some of the things that people like you to know? We like you to know the order of the stratum, plural strata, and also to know where certain cells are. For example, know that in the basale stratum, you have the melanocytes. In the spinosum, you have the keratinocytes and the Langerhans cells. But the keratinocytes, you have it, it's just the name of the cells that produce keratin. You're going to have it through all the layers. But let's walk through this. You can pause here and organize your studies, just because we could almost just say everything that is on this slide, and it is enough. We just need to go a little bit more slowly. So the basale. The basale is a layer where you have your melanocytes. So if everything goes well, if you scrape off the skin and you leave the basale layer, you have everything that you need to form the skin. So there you have stem cells, you have melanocytes that give color, and which means that these are the cells that will be dividing, these basal cells, and then the cells above are simply older. You find in this basal layer some receptors, some touch receptors called the Merkel cells. So here you have melanocyte, very marked in brown, and you have here the brown marked here. People don't have more melanocytes than others, but darker skinned people have more production of melanin. So this is actually written here. So the melanocytes produce melanin. Melanocytes exist in the basal layer. There is no great difference in numbers of melanocytes, but they are more active in darker skinned people. So another way of putting a summary, if you are a little bit like to see it in different ways, but it's exactly the same thing. So the key aspect is the most basal, the most on the bottom. It has the melanocytes and it has the tactile epithelial cells. Then you enter the stratum that is spinosum. In the stratum spinosum, you have already the production of keratin. So you say that these epithelial cells are keratinocytes. In the spinosum, you have defense cells that are called macrophages. You know, they are called Langerhans cells. There is a huge, several years ago, you would learn that these are dendritic cells. And dendritic cells are cells that present antigens to the T cells. There is a debate because there's a huge overlap between dendritic cells and macrophages. Macrophages are big phagocyting cells that may also sit in the tissues. More recently, although there is a debate, people believe that the Langerhans cells are macrophages, not dendritic cells. But you see that slide that I have took it from an anatomy book, a recent anatomy book, and called it dendritic cells. In fact, the debate between what is dendritic cell and what is a macrophage is still active. So not everyone agrees on what to call a dendritic cell and what to call the macrophages. But whatever you decide to call it, whether it's dendritic or macrophages, which more correctly nowadays we call it resident macrophages, these are cells that present antigens. They are there, they break down antigens, break down things into antigens to activate then the lymphocytes. And so you have to know that these are in the stratum spinosum. Let's just show you here what the Langerhans cell looks like. So classically, historically, they would be called dendritic cells. And so there they are, either getting antigens from the skin or from microbes that they get, and then they will release those antigens through that go into the lymph, and they will be activating them, activating the B cells. So these two components you have to know, that the spinosum has the Langerhans cells and has the keratinocytes. In the granulosum, so we have the keratinocytes are there, but see how big, how thin this layer may be. Look at this. But it may be relatively thick in areas that have calluses. So this is essentially a lot of keratin. And the cells are still somewhat alive because they still have nuclei. After this layer, the cells will start losing their appearance, and you have the lucidum layer or stratum, in which the cells don't have a nucleum, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have organelles, and therefore are very clear. So you see that in this diagram here, the lucidum is just this really thin layer. And in certain areas of the body, you have this area, but you may not be able to distinguish or find this area in other areas of the body. And finally, you have the corneum. The corneum is consider mostly dehydrated dead cells. So these are the skeins, the flakes of keratin that exist there. So I walk you through this very slowly. You have to think almost like an instructor and see what are the questions we need to ask you. So one is the order, and then you have to ask yourself those questions, where do you find those specific cells. So this is a different area of the skin. You see that here the basale, the spinosum, the granulosum, you don't find the lucidum, and you find a corneum. Don't forget, these are all squamous. You look for the shape of the cell in the top layers, not in the bottom layers. The dermis itself is almost causing, not almost, but it is almost like, let me just use the almost. It seems that I want to say almost. So imagine that the epidermis as a lining, but imagine you putting a sheet under on top of a sand, and so whatever shape the sand has, it's the sand, and the sheet just covers. So the epidermis doesn't give a lot of shape to or a lot of markings to the skin. The markings come from the dermis that is underneath. We have two layers of dermis. We have the papillary dermis and the reticulary dermis. So the papillary dermis is the typical connective tissue that you find, the areolar connective tissue that you find underneath a lot of epithelium. And then a little bit below, so you have the reticulary dermis. That's where you have a little bit more dense, irregular connective tissue. So you can include all this as connective tissue, and don't worry too much about that, but just to continue to using the terms. So papillary dermis includes the dermal papilla, and the papilla are these little projections, and the reticulary dermis is underneath. So the papilla dermis has then these dermapapilla, but it's also this area, and so by extending itself into the epithelium is allowing the epithelium to nourish the epithelium. So the nourishment of the epithelium comes from the dermis. It's on this area that you have, for example, the epidermal ridges, which are elevations of the dermal ridges, and basically these elevations leave markings. For example, in our these markings are what we call the fingerprinting. Let me just show you. I'll show you in a little bit of this, I think. And then there is something called other markings, for example, more from the lower level, the reticularies, can lead to cleavage lines and flexor lines. So the cleavage lines are lines that separate the different collagen fibers, and flexor lines, you find areas that are, not necessarily wrinkles, but if you want, they are the areas that we are born with, and they will be stronger as we move, because those are creases, for example, in our palms or wrists or soles or fingers or toes. They're better seen in the picture, so I'm going to go ahead and show you the picture. So you have the friction ridges, so these are the fingerprinting. The flexor lines are lines that we have naturally in certain areas. So for example, the wrist, the palms of the head. The cleavage lines are lines that are less noticeable, and so they represent underlying separations between collagen bundles. That's something more that a plastic surgeon, for example, may be more attentive to. So the lines are not more of a curiosity for you, if anything. We don't all need to know all this anatomy into all this detail, but let's now summarize it. So you have epidermis, and the dermis you have the papillary layer and the reticular. So the papillary layer, think about nourishment. The reticular layer, you think about also an additional layer, an additional layer of nourishment, but that's where you have those, you have to, it contributes to other cleavages. The cleavage lines and the flexure lines. So how do we get the skin color? The skin color, the essential component is the melanin that comes from the melanocytes. But other things, such as the level of hemoglobin we have, if we have more red cells or less, or even some pigments, if we ate some more pigments like keratin, we may have more skin color. So I would pause here. You see, it's not very difficult, just a few elements. Some of them are interesting, like almost curiosities that, or curious facts that we can share with one another. Then moving to accessory structures. So the accessory structures, we have the hair follicles, the exocrine glands, and the nails. Out of these, the most important for sure is a revision, will be a review about the exocrine glands. But I want to talk to you about some anatomy of the hair follicles and the nails. These areas of hair follicles and nails, if you go into a more aesthetic, cosmetic, or other components, you naturally will find this more useful. But for most of us, it's not very, very helpful. But I will still mention a few things that are helpful. So let's start with the hair follicle. So the hair follicles have a certain structure, and the hair has a certain anatomy. So you would talk about a hair in a way that you probably would talk about a plant. So you talk about a root of the hair, a shaft, and then the shaft emerges out of the skin. The hair bulb, the hair root terminates deeply into a hair bulb. These are things that if you have hair that you pulled, you may even see the hair bulb with a hair papilla. Many muscles have many areas of the body have hair that is connected with a muscle that pulls the hair up. This is the erector pili muscles. So it stands up, make the hair stand up straight. Got to know these erector pili muscles. You can further divide the hair and look at the inside of the hair and the outside. The outside we call the cortex, and the inside we call the medulla. So you will see this kind of pattern in many organs in which there is a cortex, the outside or outer part would be a better word, and the medulla is the inside. You'll see that, for example, in lymph nodes. You see that, for example, in the spleen as well. So a medulla has a central core. The cortex is the outer part, and the very thin layer that covers the hair, let me just represent it here, could be the cuticle. The cuticle, it's almost like you have to scrape it, so something you could scrape off. There is a certain, the hair maturity, or the hair can help us understand a little bit of maturity and development. And so, for example, and without mentioning the actual terms, we all kind of don't expect to see a baby with beard. We also don't expect to see a woman with very thick facial hair. So there are things that are biological, so that have to be the biological sex, but also things that have to do with the age. And so there are, so again, as we have these conversations, you may see a woman with beard, even even, a woman that was born a woman, so a person of female sex, may have a lot of hair, and that's a condition that's called hirsutism. But don't forget that in terms of gender, you can see a male that identifies themselves as female, and there you go, you have a woman with beard. So in biology, we prefer to keep the word female and male because that reflects the sex. But when in doubt, just emphasize the word biologic sex, or so that it makes it a little bit more clear that you are not outdated in your thinking. So the body hair when we are born is very thin and soft. This is called the vellus hair. As the hair gets darker and coarser, so thicker, we get the terminal hair. With puberty, a lot of hair becomes terminal, and so the state where you see in your patient terminal hair can tell you if they underwent, or is another element for you to consider if the patient underwent adolescence or puberty or not. So that's mainly the classification, the vellus and the terminal. The lanugo is, or lanugo is, that very hair is like, it looks like the baby are born, some baby come with a lot of hair. That hair is supposed to fall after 3 months. So terminal hair is the hair that is dark and coarse. We all have terminal hair in unexpected places. That is not a disease, that's just maturation. But when we call it, when it may indicate a hormonal problem, that's a different story. That would be a lot of hair. So we talk about the head, the eyebrows, and the eyelashes. The hair has a growth cycle, and the hair grows and lasts around, it can stay in an active phase for up to 5 years, and then it rests. And so the resting sometimes is called, when the hair is rested, is called club hair. And so the club hair falls, and then new hair replaces it. The male pattern of baldness is something that is essentially marked by receding of hair, and then baldness on the top of the head. These are really just more to help you understand certain things, not so much material that we are going to ask you to memorize for the exam. So this is the cycle of the hair. So you see that it grows, it may grow 2 to 5 years, but then it becomes dormant, that either may be reactivated or may fall. More material for the exam is coming back to the glands in the skin. This is very important, and this will tie with the type of secretion that we spoke about. So we have a big distinction between sebaceous and sweat glands. And within sweat glands, we can include things that we may not think as sweat, which are the cerumen, so the wax, the earwax, and the mammary glands. Some books call these modified sweat glands. Some books just call it sweat glands. But in any case, it's a good place to mention them here. So what are the function of the glands? Depending on which gland you're talking about, but there's surely an aspect of lubrication and thermoregulation as well. Let's start about sebaceous. Sebaceous glands produce the sebum. Sebum is something oily that is normally around areas where you have hairs, but it can also go into areas that don't have hairs. So the typical sebaceous glands are the ones that make the hair wet, make the hair oily, But there are also sebaceous glands or sebaceous follicles that lubricate the skin. So the sebum has a certain oily characteristic. It inhibits growth of certain bacteria, but it also allows the growth of other bacteria that likes the sebum. Don't forget, sebaceous gland, it's the entire cell, it explodes, and so it is the holocrene secretion. The sebum, the grease is protective to a certain extent because it lubricates the skin, but it also may capture dirt. What about sweat glands? The sweat glands can be of two varieties, the apocrine and the eccrine or merocrine. The apocrine release the top part. So we are talking about the glands that, the apocrine sweat glands are glands that they release more than the eccrine. So the eccrine secretion is a secretion through vesicles, remember, but this is the simple sweat, the simple wetness that you have, for example, in the palm of the hands, or, for example, we call this perspiration or sweat. The apocrine you only find in certain areas, and that is the one that releases a certain thick and has a certain smell to it that may, in evolution, may have hormones attracting other mates, but for most of us, we just are concentrated on the negative aspect, that they smell more and they're thicker. So you find the apocrine in areas where you normally would put your deodorant, like the armpits, axilla, the groin, but you may also find it in the nipple. So apocrine, axilla, groin, nipples, viscous, may have a function of communication with the fair hormones, but what is the method of the secretion? The top part of the cell dies or bursts to form the secretion. Okay, so you see here an apocrine is not a sebum. This is apocrine releasing into the hair, for example, of the axilla, the groin, and the nipples. The sweat glands release a lot of water and salt and urea and ammonia and uric acid, which are all products of protein metabolization, and they will be wetting the body, but in what we call an insensible way. So in other words, we are not sensitive to it. We normally don't detect. Most of us don't detect the water that we're losing through the palms of the hands or through the body, except if it's a lot. So these are eccrine, so they release the secretion through vesicles. And a lot of people have this nervous sweat too, so there is a component of nervous regulation, or being regulated by the nervous system. Other glands that we can consider part of the skin are the mammary gland, which we consider a special type or a modified type of apocrine gland. So when a woman gets pregnant, after the woman delivers, there will be the production of a hormone called prolactin that will stimulate the production of milk. The ceruminous glands, the wax is also an apocrine gland and produces the earwax, which has its own benefits as far as protecting the ear. So this is what the earwax glands look like in histology. And that's it. So I would stop here and explain relate all these exocrine glands. You absolutely need to know the different types of secretions you have in the skin. So sebum, the sebum that comes from sebaceous, the sweat that can come from apocrine, and how is it different from the sweat that comes from the eccrine or merocrine glands. Then understand what type of gland is a mammary gland and what type of gland is a ceruminous gland. When you're ready, we are going to go and speak about nails. Nails have its own anatomy. We normally don't pay much attention to the nails, but there are certain words that they may be important in your practice. For example, a person may speak of the nail bed. A nail bed is the place where the nail sits, and then all we see about it is the nail body. The body of a nail or the body of a structure is the main structure. And then everything else that sticks out of it, you could distinguish. For example, the edge of the nail. The spaces in between the nail and the skin, you can call it grooves. So you may have a patient that has an infection in a nail groove, or a fold too. A fold is different. A fold is the actual fold of skin. The groove is the space in between. The white part that you see growing up is the lunula. And if these are the lateral folds, we can call this the proximal folds. The eponychium is sometimes called the cuticles, and is that kind of dry skin that exists between the nail and the skin, or in the proximal nail fold. You can also call the cuticle. Okay, and again, you compare these things that stick out from the body, from somewhere as a root, and the free edge. See, here you can also use the terms proximal, proximal to the root, and distal. You would go anatomically in an anatomical position, so it wouldn't be very informative to talk about posterior and anterior things. In this case, you talk about superficial and deeper things. This is just not very important for us, but as everything gets a little bit, our skin changes dramatically, and the dermis changes, and the epidermis gets thinner, so it's part of the aging as well. The same thing affects also the hair follicles and even the blood supply. So this is just, a summary of possible effects of aging. It's more for your own knowledge, not very important for us to think about that. In terms of the burns, you don't necessarily need to know the burns for the exam unless I make an announcement. One of the things that I want to make sure you understand is that the lectures are reused. So I naturally don't record a lecture just for the sake of recording it. If I find that I record a good lecture, I keep it. And so, but sometimes there are announcements that are made in lecture that don't pertain to you. They pertain to other semesters or that are no longer valid. So you can't say, you cannot go by any announcement in lecture. Like, oh, you told me in lecture that the exam is next week, but after all, this semester, the exam is 2 weeks ago. So that doesn't, you always need to pay attention to the announcements. But burns normally is a clinical piece of knowledge that I like to talk about it just to explain to you the importance of understanding the epidermis. So the burns are classified in degrees, being the higher the degree, the deeper it goes. So let me just show you. For example, first degrees just affects the epidermis, but if they are second degrees, it will affect more layers, including the dermis, and the third degree or fourth degree goes beyond the dermis, in which the full degree is a full thickness, but if it goes beyond the skin, you talk about a fourth degree. One key aspect of burning, and that's why the clinical aspects are important, is that burns are a major challenge for hydration. So you're going to lose a lot of water if you don't have skin, but also it's an entry point for bacteria. So those are two main examples of what the skin is important for. I just want to mention skin cancer just to relate with the epidermis layers. We have 3 types of skin cancer. It's a clinical note. Clinical notes are to make your study more interesting, not necessarily things that we are going to cover in the exam. They may be on a quiz just to push you to study that. We have basal, squamous, and melanoma. Melanoma is a cancer of melanocytes, so it's just about the melanocytes. It's very malignant, tends to be a very dangerous, very malignant cancer. And then the cancer can come either from the basal layer or from the keratinocytes. If it comes from the keratinocytes, it's called squamous cell carcinoma. If it comes from the basal layer, it's called basal cell carcinoma. This is just to help you understand that you're not learning things just for the sake of learning, but these things have clinical implication. So let me just show you where the different cancers come from. Basal layer for the basocellular, melanocytes for the melanoma, and keratinocytes for the squamous cell carcinoma. Examples, not that seeing them is pathognomonic, is you're going to be you are going to be able to make the diagnosis, but a melanoma is naturally, it's like it has the pigmentation. This is a squamous, and this is the basal cell carcinoma. Okay, so we end here this topic.